Welcome, Don, to the second AMA we're doing with you. I'm honored to have you here. Very pleased and excited.
Thank you, Jack.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Thanks for coming on, Don. It's always a huge honor.
Thank you very much, Ramana and Jack, both of you, for your kind invitation. It's good to be here.
Thank you, Don. Thank you. Okay, so I want to start with something maybe silly, but your TED Talk. I think the last time I checked it was yesterday. I think at about 2 million views. So it's going great. I think you're one in the top 100, maybe top 250 of the TED Talks. So do you ever get recognized when you go outside? Is there someone, like when you do groceries and someone comes up to you and say, "Yo, Mr. Hoffman, I've seen you on TED and I've watched your videos," and does it ever happen to you? Because if I would see you walking down the street in Amsterdam or something, I would certainly stop you and say hi, and that's. But does it ever happen to you?
No, it doesn't. So fortunately, I can live my life with normal anonymity. I can just go to the store and no one looks twice. So I've taught classes here. I'm at the University of California at Irvine, and sometimes when I teach a class with 500 students, and I go to a store, one of the students will be working in the store, and they'll say hi to me. But that hasn't happened for a while either. So yeah, I'm enjoying my anonymity.
Oh, that's great. That's fine. That's fine too. But if I ever see you walking, I will stop you. Just know if you're in Amsterdam or something, then. So there you go. I see someone else already has a question, so I'm gonna invite Brainbow to the stage. So,
okay.
Hi, Brainbow.
Hello.
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 You wanted to ask a question?
So I had a question referencing your paper, Fact, Fiction, Fitness.
Okay.
And I noticed that when you're coming up with the fitness algorithms or fitness functions, my question was,
Yes.
do you really believe that those are an accurate representation of natural selection processes? And because to me it seems like it would be more efficient to just kind of have a veridical representation of the actual particles that are, being emitted or reflected and, recorded by the light sensitive molecules in our, sensory systems.
Great. So the idea of the fitness payoff functions is that evolution by natural selection has been turned into a mathematically precise theory, right? So Darwin wasn't a mathematician, and he was a biologist, and he didn't really use mathematics very much in his theory. But John Maynard Smith in the 1970s took Darwin's ideas and mathematics of game theory and wedded them, and gave us evolutionary game theory. And it's been a wonderfully powerful mathematical model. We have evolutionary game theory and graph theory. And one of the key aspects of that mathematics are the fitness payoff functions that Maynard Smith's formalism involves. So in game theory, right, you get points or lose points depending on how you play and who you're competing with. And so the idea was to use that idea in modeling evolution. And in some sense, in our interactions with other organisms and with the environment, our actions will have fitness payoffs. If I eat poison ivy, I will have negative fitness payoffs. If I eat a steak, I might have positive fitness payoffs. If I try to mate with a tree, there'll be negative fitness payoffs. If I, try to climb a tree to get away from a predator, there'll be positive. So you can think about fitness payoff functions as functions that depend on whatever the state of the world is. So whatever the world is, it has some state. Also depends on the organism, like a person versus, say a monkey versus a cow, and the state of that person or that animal, and then also the action, feeding, fighting, mating, and fleeing, and so forth. So they're complicated functions. But they determine, so whenever you do an evolutionary game theoretic analysis, you always specify a fitness payoff function. That's what you do to analyze that evolutionary process. You specify a fitness payoff functions. And then you look at various strategies and how they would do, what kinds of payoffs they would get in that environment. So that's what we do in our fact, fiction, and fitness paper. We ask a very simple question, actually. In the case of perception, we're interested in, are the structures that we see in perception, like, for example, my perception of distance. I see things as ordered from near to far. You could think of it as a total or a partial order, or hot. From cold to hot. That's sort of a total, or things could be colder or hotter. So you might imagine that there's some structure in objective reality that's like say, for example, a total order. And then you can ask, okay, suppose objective reality really did have that structure, a total order. For us to be tuned to that order, the fitness payoffs are going to have information about that total order, right? If the fitness payoffs have no information about a structure in the world, and structure in objective reality, then if we're tuned to the fitness payoffs, we can't be tuned to the structure in objective reality because the fitness payoffs have no information about that structure. So let me
right. Sorry.
Okay,
I wanted to get a clarification point on that.
Yeah, sure.
Well, my actual question is, like, do you really think that the fitness payoff functions are an accurate reflection of, like, where evolution is actually driving us towards? Because if there is an objective, observer independent world, then the molecules of our sensory systems are, like, they're particle detectors, right? Like, your retina has a photosensitive molecule that is detecting light, and it has done this outside of a biological system. So there has to be a particle of that observer independent world present in order to be detected. So it's just like, I just don't understand how we're getting from, like, your sensory systems are particle detectors to we're striving towards these payoff functions. I guess I'm kind of missing that connection there.
Oh, okay, great. Right, so there's two different levels here that we need to talk about. And the first is to just say, if we want to talk about evolution, and we want to ask the evolutionary question, are our senses shaped to see objective reality as it is, or close to how it is? Then to answer that question, if you're interested in that question, then you have to use evolutionary game theory or evolutionary graph theory, something like that. And then the question is, do the fitness payoffs have the information needed to do that, to actually shape sensory systems, to see true structures in the world? And what it's straightforward to show, especially if you're working with a mathematician who's good. You don't have to do it yourself. It's straightforward to show that these fitness payoff functions don't have that information. So evolutionary game theory entails. Now, I'm not saying that evolution by natural selection is the true or final theory. I'm just saying, if you take evolution by natural selection seriously, and the right way to do that right now is to use evolutionary game theory and use mathematical precision, then the answer is very, very clear. The probability is precisely zero that any sensory system of any organism has ever been shaped to see any aspect of objective reality. It's just, now you can say, okay, that means there's something wrong with theory of evolution by natural selection or the mathematical model of evolution. That's perfectly fine. I'm just telling you what that theory says. I'm not trying to propose the theory as being the final word or not. I'm just saying, now on the physics, you're taking another angle. You're asking about a more physics kind of approach to this whole question.
Right.
So I'll stop on the evolutionary side, and now I'll talk on the physics side. So just on the evolutionary side, the answer is probability zero. On the physics side, what is the probability that space-time and objects are parts of the fundamental nature of objective reality? Well, it turns out that physicists like David Gross, he has a paper in 2005, I can give you the reference for it. Basically, he won the Nobel Prize for his work in string theory. And he points out that he and many other physicists think that space-time is not fundamental. As they put it, space-time is doomed. And Nima Arkani-Hamed at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton is saying very, very strongly, if you're interested and want to understand why, if you just Google Nima Arkani-Hamed and his Harvard class, he had a course at Harvard in 2019. So you can listen, he's got about 25 or 30 lectures where he explains why particles in space-time are not fundamental reality. As he puts it, space-time is doomed. But what they're finding is that if you let go of space-time and you let go of our intuitive understanding of particles and objects in space-time as being fundamental, you just let that go, you find these deeper structures called the amplituhedron, cosmological polytopes, associahedron. These are structures completely beyond space-time. They're beyond quantum theories. So there are no Hilbert spaces. There's the quantum theory as well is not fundamental. So space-time, Einstein's space-time and quantum theory themselves together are not fundamental, but they show how space-time and quantum theory emerge from these deeper structures beyond space-time, like the amplituhedron. So what's really striking to me is that two of the main pillars of modern science, namely evolution by natural selection, and also then in physics, quantum field theory with Einstein's theory of gravity, both of our pillars are telling us the same thing. The probability is zero that objects in space-time, as we perceive them, are the fundamental nature of reality. It's precisely zero. So but that's the power of science, right? Those, if you think about it, those scientific theories were built by people who assumed that space-time and objects are fundamental. Darwin surely believed that space-time and organisms, for physical objects like organisms are fundamental. And physicists, have for centuries been taking space and time, or space-time and objects as fundamental. The glory of science is when we take our assumptions and we make them mathematically precise into genuine theories, those theories come back and become our instructors. They become our teachers, and they tell us that some of our assumptions are deeply wrong. For example, our assumption that we're seeing space and time as it is.
If I can try to clarify what I think this person is asking, they're saying that sensory system, it would be simpler for sensory systems to directly perceive particles instead of molding reality for fitness. So just particles going inside the sensory systems without any additional interpretation or molding of the sensory data. If that makes sense.
Well, that would make sense if particles were real and existed when they were not perceived.
Right.
When physicists tell us that space-time is doomed, they're saying those particles aren't there when they're not perceived. We create the particles in the act of observation. So.
All right. Thank you so much for your answer. That was really interesting.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Rainbow. All right. Raman, I suppose you have a couple of questions?
Yeah.
Go ahead, man.
So I have a question from Hurry Curry, and that is, can you please tell us more about how conscious realism can be tested? Can you tell me when it will be tested? Are there any tests you can do outside the Wigner's friend experiment that replaces humans with photons? Can you repeat the Wigner's friend experiment with a large enough observer to cause decoherence?
Right. So those are, of course, the right kinds of questions to ask. How do we test conscious realism? What kind of empirical tests can we make for it? So one thing that we have to do is to have a theory about how conscious agents and their dynamics would give rise to space and time, right? Because all the experiments that we can do are in space and time, right? So if you don't have an apparatus in space and time, then you can't test the theory. So the first question we have to answer to get that kind of empirical test is to ask, how in the world do dynamics of conscious agents lead to space-time and the laws of physics in space-time, for example? Now, we're working on exactly that because that's the key thing we need for an empirical test. So what we're doing is we're asking, when the physicists say that space-time is not fundamental, they're not just stopping there; they're finding structures beyond space-time, like the amplitude-hedron. So I'm actually writing a paper right now. I was writing this morning. So just before I dropped it just to come here and talk. I'm writing a paper on which we're describing a way that we could start to build a bridge to build empirical tests by showing how the amplitude-hedron, which the physicists have found, arises as a description of the asymptotic behavior of the dynamics of conscious agents. So once we have, so the idea is we start with the dynamics of conscious agents. We look at the long-term trends, not just the step-by-step behavior, but the long-term trends of the conscious agents. And those long-term trends can be captured by combinatorial objects called permutations in a very, very nice way. And it turns, or decorated permutations, slight generalization of permutations, decorated in, I won't go into the technical stuff on that. But so these decorated permutations then turns out have all of the physically invariant information in the amplitude-hedron. At least for supersymmetric cases. For non-supersymmetric, you need to add helicities. And we, in this paper, are describing how we could also have helicities in addition to the permutations. So I absolutely agree with the question that we want to make empirical tests of the theory. For that, we need to actually show how dynamics of conscious agents are reflected in space-time. And for that, we're working right now on papers to chase out that math. So if anybody is interested in that and has strong mathematics and physics background, we would welcome help on showing how the amplitude-hedron comes from the asymptotics of conscious agents. So we're on it. These kinds of tests, take a long time. It took a long time to get from predictions of quantum theory. It took decades before we actually could test, for example, Bell's inequalities and so forth in quantum physics. So in these things, it takes time, but I agree with the goal, and we're working as fast as we can on it.
Thank you. I have a question for myself. Have you heard of course you've heard of it, but have you heard of Karl Friston's active inference? And
Sure.
if so, how does it fit in with your theory? If I can briefly summarize the way I understand it, it's about how organisms must place an upper bound on their internal states, and that must mean that organisms can only know the world through encoded and vicarious perception.
Right. So, yeah, this is a very interesting direction. So he ties in with the work on Bayes nets, for example, and the work by Judea Pearl and others, where they came up with this notion of a Markov blanket. And when you have a Bayes net is a directed acyclic graph, and you can have nodes. If you have a group of nodes, their Markov blanket is the set of all parents of those nodes, children of the nodes, and parents of the children of the nodes. And so what Judea Pearl and his collaborators have shown is that the state of the Bayes net outside the Markov blanket and the state of the Bayes net inside the Markov blanket, those states are conditionally independent given the state of the Markov blanket nodes. So in some sense, what that means, translated into English, is that if you're on the inside of Markov blanket, the only thing you can know about the outside is what you see on your blanket. That's all. So your blanket is effectively an interface, and the world could be anything it wants as long as it projects onto those states of the Markov blanket, and you wouldn't know the difference. So that idea fits in very, very nicely with the work we've been saying about evolution and perception, that you don't see reality as it is. All you see is effectively a user interface. The Markov blanket corresponds to what we would call a user interface. And so yeah, there's a very, very deep connection. Now, I'm not sure that Karl Friston himself would agree with what I've just said. I mean, I've heard him. It's been unclear to me in some of the talks that he's given whether he would agree. In some cases, he seems to think that we have more information than I would have expected to say about the real nature of objective reality. But I won't try to get into Karl Friston's head. I'll just say that it's absolutely a theorem of the Markov blanket formalism that it's like a user interface, and as long as the external world projects onto the same states of the Markov blanket, you won't be able to tell those different worlds. So in that sense, you can't know the truth.
Thanks, that's interesting. Prometheus asks, rather than assuming space-time is merely a data structure created by conscious agents, have you considered the idea that conscious agents are local and non-local distortions of higher dimensional space-time with unique frequencies?
Well, I mean that kind of idea is I think far more popular and a direction that most people would tend to go more quickly. But what the physicists are finding, like Nima Arkani Hamed and his collaborators, what they're finding is that they're not really going into higher dimensional space-times. So it's not like string theory where you might, or M theory where you're going to 10 or 11 dimensions or something like that. It's rather that you're walking away from the notion of space-time being fundamental, period. Even with higher dimensions, the physicists string theorists, of course, have talked about 10 or 11 dimensions of space and M theory and so forth. But physicists like David Gross, who was a string theorist, has basically flat out said space-time is doomed. And Nima Arkani Hamed, also at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, is saying the same thing, that space-time itself is not fundamental. So the idea of trying to put consciousness somehow into a higher dimensional space-time doesn't seem to fit with what the physicists are saying. And it would be more like putting a ghost in the machine, right? So I'm trying to put consciousness somehow. So there's this machine that's got its own physical structure, maybe it's 11 dimensional space or 10 dimensional space instead of, and so we're trying to shoehorn consciousness or observers into that. And so, and some people can try to do that. I'm not saying don't try to do that, but that's just not what we're doing. And it doesn't seem to me what the physicists are suggesting we should do when we find structures like the amplituhedron and cosmological polytopes. What seems to me is that what we should be trying to do is to start with consciousness qua consciousness, not as emergent from space-time, right? So we've always assumed that space-time is fundamental. And almost all of my brilliant colleagues in doing consciousness research are trying to show how consciousness emerges from neural activity or quantum states of microtubules collapsing in orchestrated fashion, or functional properties of global workspaces and things like that. They're trying to start with physical systems and show in space and time, and show how consciousness can be booted up. And I think that evolution by natural selection and our best physics tell us that space-time is doomed, and that therefore this approach of trying to start with consciousness somehow positioned inside space-time, whether it be in 4-dimensional space-time or 11-dimensional space-time, it doesn't matter. That's just, I for my money, the wrong approach. And so what we're trying to do is not take space-time as fundamental, try to show how space-time itself emerges merely as a user interface that some conscious agents use. So space-time will end up being not special at all. It will be one of countless user interfaces that agents could use to simplify their interactions. So there's nothing really special about space-time. So I've had questions like from a philosopher named Philip Goff, for example, who's a panpsychist. And these, panpsychists will take consciousness and put it in the heart of physics, so that in the particles, there's a couple of versions of it. In one version, the particles have consciousness. Physical particles, electrons, have another property, namely consciousness as another property. Or Goff will say that's not his view, that in some sense, the consciousness is the essence of what the physics is about. So the physics is just the equations, but what it's really about is about consciousnesses inside that space-time structure. And my attitude about that is again and then he says, well, why should we bother to do all this work of putting consciousness outside space-time and trying to boot up space-time? That's really hard work. Why don't we just put it inside space-time like the panpsychists do? And my attitude is, yeah, it would be a lot easier if we could do that, but the physicists tell us that space-time is doomed. So I'm not interested in trying to shoehorn consciousness into a structure that the physicists are telling me is doomed. They're the experts. They say it's doomed. Why in the world would I shoehorn consciousness into something that's doomed? Let's go with the new structures. They're saying space-time is doomed, but look here. There are these new structures, the amplitude-hedron, beyond space-time, and it gives rise to space-time. But it doesn't have quantum theory. It doesn't have space-time. It's much, much deeper, and it has new symmetries that you can't see in space-time. This is the new frontier. So my attitude is, well, consciousness researchers who want to study consciousness in space-time, they should be jumping on and go, yeehaw, it's over for space-time. Let's go and look at these new structures and try to connect with them. So that's what we're doing.
If I may comment on that, Professor Bernard Carr is studying consciousness from a dimensional perspective, so that might be useful, and metaphorically speaking. I don't think he literally thinks that consciousness is inside space and time. It's just a way of modeling things when it comes to dissociation and so on.
Oh, well, absolutely. Then, yeah, if he's not trying to shoehorn consciousness into space and time, I mean, he's I actually am not up on his latest work. He's a brilliant physicist, so absolutely. So I'd be very interested to see what he's up to these days.
Elle, do you have a question?
Me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, Donald. The question is, what is the role in your theory of valence or hedonic tone?
I couldn't. What is the role of what again? Valence?
Valence or hedonic tone?
I can't understand the last term. Hellenic. Do you guys? Can anybody understand what he's saying?
Hedonic. I'm sorry, I don't have hedonic tone.
Can you type it out in the general channel?
I'm sorry?
Can you type it out in the general channel? I'll check it out.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if my pronunciation is hedonic. A hedonic tone. Does it help, Don?
Hedonic. So hedonic tone. So you're talking about the way things feel. So
yeah, or affective valence.
So say a little bit more about what you're asking.
Oh, okay. So, how can I put it in other words? I'm asking if there is a description or an attempt of a description or a special position that not just the qualia, but the emotional tone of that qualia, basically how rewarding it is, if there is a place for that in your theory.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, absolutely. So we take the hedonic tone or the valence as part of the experiences. And so we're taking experience as fundamental, right? We're not taking space-time as fundamental. We're taking conscious experiences, including the emotional tones of conscious experiences. Even thinking has something it's like to think. So the experiential nature of thought itself and of emotions would be taken as fundamental. So every scientific theory assumes something and then tries to explain something else. There is no scientific theory of everything, right? Every scientific theory says, if you grant me these miracles, we call them assumptions, but they're the miracles of the theory. If you grant me these miracles, then I'll explain all this other neat stuff. But the theory can't explain its own miracles. So the miracles can be space and time, for example, and particles. Those can be your miracles, and then you write down. So those exist, and these are the equations that you're going to write down. And then you may say, now I want to show how conscious experiences arise from those assumptions. So if you grant me space and time and these laws of physics, then I'll show you how consciousness arises. So far, we've had no success at that, none at all, in the sense that we've not been able to explain a single specific conscious experience. So my approach is to then say, let's start with conscious experiences, including hedonic tone and valence, and then we'll start with that as the miracles of our theory, and then what we'll do is show how space and time emerge, and explain that. So the answer is yes. We any aspect of conscious experience, including emotions, hedonic tone, and valence, will all be part of the fundamental furniture of this theory.
Can I add something to the question?
Sure, go ahead.
Oh, okay, so you have speculated before in the past that the possible reason why consciousness is doing what it's doing is basically just to experience more and more different types of experiences. But I wanted to ask how that relates with the factor of hedonic tone, because we know from empirical evidence that the experiences with the highest amount of hedonic tone are generally experienced as formless, though that might just be an artifact of our limited cognitive capacities. But I wonder, why wouldn't you pick something like trying to increase that hedonic tone, which is considered the most important or the rewarding part of an experience, instead prioritize something like variety?
Prioritize like what? What was the last word?
Oh, I'm sorry, like variety, like breadth of experience.
Variety. Okay, so well, great question. So you mentioned as part of your question, if I understood you right, that you said that hedonic tone and so forth, the valence, are formless. Did I understand you correctly when you said they were formless?
Well, I wouldn't be able to say if they're formless or not, but that apparently the experiences that we have empirical evidence that have the highest amount of valence are described as formless, which will be, for example, basically nirvana.
Oh, I see. Oh, okay.
Or union with the Godhead.
Right. So, well, it may not have to be either or. It could be both and. That in some sense. And by the way, the answer, the fundamental answer is, what is consciousness up to and why? The answer is I don't know. Right. So when I'm proposing stuff, I'm just saying, we need to have some good ideas here, and there's a pretty deep question. So Gödel's incompleteness theorem indicates that there's no exploration there's no end to the exploration of mathematical structure, and that suggests to me that there's no end to the exploration of the possibilities of consciousness. So that could be one thing that consciousness is up to, but that doesn't preclude that maybe what consciousness does is it effectively tries on different headsets. Let me try this virtual reality and explore that for a while. Let me lose myself completely in that VR for a while. I'm born into this world as a baby. I pee my diapers. I depend on my mom and dad for everything to keep me alive. I just really plunge myself in completely in this thing, and I'm completely lost in it. But that way, I'm taking it quite seriously, and I explore it. And eventually, my identification with my physical form, there's some hedonic stuff that goes along with that, namely suffering. To the extent that we identify with our bodies and that we begin to anticipate our own death and so forth, and we think that's all we are, then we start to have psychological suffering. So the hedonic thing starts to come in as sort of a guide to that consciousness has given itself to sort of wake up. So it could be that the hedonic aspect and this exploration are not opposites or not antagonistic ideas. They could be part of one deeper process in which your consciousness is plunging itself into various virtual realities, and there's countless of them. But it has these hedonic guides that help it first explore and really lose itself, but then wake back up to what it really is, and it comes to know itself in a much richer way. That's one possibility.
Okay.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you, Donald.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, okay. Don, what are your thoughts on artificial intelligence, or actually more specifically, artificial consciousness?
Right. So I'm interested in artificial intelligence for a long time. Actually, even as a teenager, I was quite interested in it, and I ended up going and being in the AI lab at MIT, as well as the what's now the Brain and Cognitive Science Department. So I've been interested in human cognition as well as artificial intelligence for a long, long time. And the standard approach has about AI and consciousness has been that perhaps if we get complex circuitry and software that's has the right kind of functional properties, then consciousness might somehow emerge or arise from that. So yeah, sentience could come. And the idea that's often put out is that, look, brains are just machines. They're biological machines, and brains somehow create consciousness. So why shouldn't silicon-based machines also be able to create consciousness? So that's a pretty standard view on things. And I think for principled reasons that you cannot start with physical ingredients like particles in space and time or circuits and software or neurons and try to boot up. No one's been able to succeed in explaining any specific conscious experience, right? So if you look at all the work that's been done in that vein, where I'll just name orchestrated collapse of microtubule states, integrated information theory, global workspace theory, and theories like those. If you ask the proponents of them, and I have repeatedly, they're good friends of mine, and they know I'm going to ask them. I ask them, okay, give me a specific conscious experience. What is the integrated information that must be the taste of chocolate and could not be the taste of vanilla? They can't do it. Give me orchestrated, to Stuart Hamroff, my good friend Stuart Hamroff. I've asked him in public on stage, Stuart, okay, give me what's the orchestrated collapse of quantum states of microtubules that has to be, the smell of coffee and couldn't be the smell of perfume. And you can't do it. And he knows the next time on stage, I'll ask him the same question. You cannot start with unconscious ingredients in space and time and boot up consciousness. And you've never been able to do it. And even Steve Pinker, in his book Enlightenment Now, points out that he likes the global workspace theory, but Pinker admits that the global workspace theory can't actually get to. It says the last dollop in the theory that there's actually something it likes. It's like so there's something it feels like to be a state of a global workspace. He says that may have to be stipulated. That's just a place where the theory can't go. Well, that, in my attitude, that was what the whole theory was about, of interest in your theory vis-a-vis consciousness. But that's where we're stuck. We start with physical theories. We simply can't boot up the consciousness. But I'm not sure. Does that get at your question, or is there an aspect to it that you would like me to focus on a bit better?
Maybe there are two questions in there, and there is already an assumption in there. You already touched it, and that is the assumption that we can somehow generate consciousness. But assuming we don't know how to generate consciousness, or just assuming it's not possible to generate it from physicality, but is there any reason for inorganic matter not to run already existing consciousness, let's say? So instead of creating consciousness, which you say is not possible, is it impossible for inorganic matter like a machine to house, let's use that metaphor, consciousness?
Right. So I'll take a completely different point of view than the standard view on this, right? So cool. I'm going to agree with the physicist that space-time is doomed. Space-time is not fundamental. That's what our best physics tells us. So I'm not going to try to put consciousness inside space-time. I'll put it behind space-time. And think of space-time as merely a user interface that some conscious agents use to interact with other consciousnesses. On that assumption, the distinction we make between living and non-living is not principled. It's an artifact of our interface. Right? So I look at a person and I say, oh, definitely alive. My cat, definitely alive. A virus, possibly. A proton, absolutely not. It's not alive. Well, is that a genuine insight into a fundamental principle distinction in reality of living versus non-living? Absolutely not. It's like if right now I'm looking at your on my desktop through pixels. Some of the pixels are pixels about your face, and through those pixels, I'm getting some insight into your consciousness and to your living as a human being. Others are pixels about a window or a wall. And so what I want to say that some pixels are alive and other pixels are dead. No, that's silly. That's an artifact it's a misunderstanding of the pixels are just pixels. The pixels are a portal. Some of the pixels provide a portal into your consciousness, others do not. And so the distinction between living and non-living, as well as the distinction between conscious and unconscious, is not a principal distinction. And that's a pretty strong statement, and it has profound implications. But in the artificial intelligence realm, what it means is this. We do know that our space-time interface provides portals to consciousness. We call them the human body, for example, the body of my cat. That seems to be a portal into consciousness or to life. Whereas other parts of my interface, like when I look at a rock, the portal is pretty dim. There's no obvious, I'm not seeing, but that's no surprise. An interface has to dumb things down and hide things. That's what an interface does. So it's no surprise that my interface at some point gives up. So here's the question about artificial intelligence within this new framework. The question is not, how do we start with physical systems that are unconscious and boot up conscious artificial intelligence? That's the wrong question. The question is different. How can we study our interface and understand it, how it creates portals into consciousness, like the human body? Can we understand that? And can we understand how to build new portals into consciousness? So we have one technology, right? Is having kids. Having kids is a way of building new portals into consciousness. So we have one technology for building new portals. It's low tech, but it is a technology for creating new interfaces. I
like how you described this. Yes.
It's a geeky way to do it. So just the last point on this, and then I'll stop. So the question is, once we understand that, can we reverse engineer our interface and open up new portals into consciousness? And would those new portals look like technology, like silicon and circuits, like artificial intelligence? And my answer is, why not? I suspect that we will be able to reverse engineer our interface, open up new portals into consciousness, but it won't be creating consciousness out of unconscious ingredients. It will be understanding our interface well enough that we open up new portals into a pre-existing consciousness.
Thank you. Very nicely stated. I think Raman has some comments on this.
I can present Bernardo's point of view. I think he slightly disagree with you. Yeah, he thinks that,
okay.
Well, look, my Google Chrome icon and the trash bin icon are two different icons, and they're both just icons, but they point to different processes. My Google Chrome icon points to a different process than the trash bin icon. So what Bernardo would say, I hope I'm representing him correctly, is that the icon of life, the icon of metabolism, is what indicates dissociation in the universal mind, or in other words, something with a private point of view, and that's why he wouldn't ascribe private inner life to silicon-based computers.
Right. So yeah, Bernardo and I are good friends. We go back quite a few years now, and we're pretty much on the same page. Now, on this particular topic, it would be interesting to talk with him and see what he says. It may be that what Bernardo was saying on this is that when I have an icon like a human body, right, then I have to be very, very careful in dealing with that icon, because I'm clearly dealing with consciousness and something that has intentionality and can feel pain and so forth. Whereas when I'm dealing with the rock icon, it's not obvious about the intentionality or the pain and so forth. Now, I think that, so I actually, you raised a good point. I think it would be fun to talk with Bernardo and see what his ideas are on this point. Does he really see? My point of view is that when I'm interacting with what I call a rock, I am interacting with conscious agents, but but my interaction is so crude that I have no insight into the nature of those conscious agents. And probably my effect on the conscious agents is so crude that I can't really hurt them. So I don't need to worry about a rock. So in other words, Bernardo and I might be saying the same thing, but in slightly different ways. I might be saying, look, I don't have to worry about intentionality or anything like that when I'm dealing with a rock, because even though I'm interacting with conscious agents, my interactions are such that I'm not going to really be harming them, or hurting them in any way. Whereas my interface in other cases, like with a human being, give me access to ways to hurt them and so forth. So I would agree. Great question, and I should actually ask Bernardo about that sometime.
How do gods, or God, or the concept of God, how does it fit into your theory, Don? Does it?
Well, so the notion of God in spiritual traditions, they'll say that, of course, in some sense, God transcends any description, right? So the word God is just a pointer to something that, even though you might have a picture, Michelangelo's God touching man, and that kind of picture of God having being an old man with a white beard and so forth. I don't think any religion really takes that seriously. God is something that transcends. It's not just an old man in a beard and in a chair. God is something far deeper and far more profound. And in the theory of conscious agents, we start off for obvious reasons with these finite agents, right? So they're certainly not God. They're not infinite. So they're conscious agents that have a finite range of conscious experiences and finite range of ways of interacting with each other. And we look at their interactions, and it turns out when they interact, when conscious agents interact, they form new conscious agents. So in fact, if you have any collection of conscious agents, they in fact satisfy the definition of a conscious agent, and so there is a new conscious agent. So suppose I start off with a countable infinity of conscious agents. Okay, so an infinite number of these conscious agents. Well, then any possible combination of agents is another agent. So there's going to be 2 to the n combinations, the power set. So, and it turns out that Cantor tells us that is a new size of infinity. So if I start off with a countable infinity, what's called Aleph 0 number of conscious agents, then I immediately get, by combination, I get Aleph 1, a new higher infinity of conscious agents. But then I can do that again, take combinations of those new agents, and I go to Aleph 2 and Aleph 3. And Cantor tells us that there's no end to this. So God, in this framework, would be this unattainable limit as I look at all the possible combinations of all these agents and climb up Cantor's hierarchy. I can never get to the end because there's an infinite, it's an infinitely long process, and that's what God is. So what's really interesting in that case is the theory of conscious agents can tell you, in some sense, how far it's gotten towards the theory of God. Right now, we've only been able to study exhaustively the combination of 2 agents. We're working on 3. We have a little ways to go. So once we get to infinity, a countable infinity, which probably won't happen in my lifetime, then we go to Aleph 1. Now we'll have Aleph 2, Aleph 3. So our theory is going to have lots of humility for us at every step of the way, because it will say, great, you now understand 3 agents, now 4 agents, now 5 agents, wonderful work. Well, you still have infinitely more to go. And no matter how far we go, the theory will say, effectively, you've now done the first 1 billion levels of Cantor's hierarchy, but there's infinitely more to go. So this is a truly humbling approach to the notion of God. So in some sense, I like this. God is supposed to transcend any concepts, and this theory says precisely how badly the theory is doing with respect to the fundamental concept. So, but the nice thing about it is that it really is so I think in the spirit that I just gave it, I think it actually is in the spirit of many spiritual traditions to say that the word God, anything we can say about God, is only a pointer. And all we're doing, in some sense, is saying with the mathematical model of conscious agents, we have a far more precise set of pointers And the pointers themselves now tell us explicitly how far we've gone and how far we have to go. So it's a real antidote to dogmatism. And that's been, many spiritual traditions have had trouble with dogmatism. Maybe not the true practitioners who are, but many of the, when spirituality turns into religion, that's often when there's a dogmatism that comes into this. So having a mathematical approach to this, I like, because it's a real antidote to dogmatism. We actually won't fight over our pointers. We will be actually having scientific discussions about them.
Thanks for your insights on this subject. Yeah, I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to give it back to Raman. We briefly discussed time, and that time is at least generated from consciousness, and it doesn't have standalone existence. Am I wrong so far?
Right.
Okay, so, but Max, he asks, but if we perceive time and evolution has given us these not veridical perceptions, doesn't that mean that time is, well, that means that time isn't veridical, but since evolution requires at least sequentiality, doesn't that mean that time is veridical? I know it's not a I got you there, but it's more like a request for clarification. It's a difficult point.
Oh, it's a very, very good question, and so I'll try to answer it at two different levels. First, on the evolutionary question, this is a point that I think causes a lot of confusion about how scientists work in this area. What I do is I say, let me assume, for sake of argument, evolution by natural selection. It does things like say there's temporal evolution. It says that there are organisms and so forth. So I say, okay, great. Let me take that theory and see what it entails. Well, it entails the probability of zero that we see reality as it is. That means space and time. So the theory almost seems to refute itself. It's saying that the probability that what we're seeing is the truth is zero. Well, that's the power of scientific theories. When you take them seriously, they tell you their limits. So for example, in Einstein's theory of space-time, the theory itself, which is the theory of space-time, tells us that space-time itself can't be fundamental. That's what it's the theory of space-time that said, and we built the theory of space-time assuming that space-time is fundamental, and the theory comes back and says the theory of space-time doesn't even make sense. It has no operational meaning when you get down to 10 to the minus 33 centimeters or 10 to the minus 43 seconds. It has no operational meaning below the Planck scale. So the same thing with evolution by natural selection. Right. So, and this is philosophers and a lot of people trying to, who are unhappy with our theorems, try to get these kinds of horns of dilemma kind of thing, and they don't understand how science has to use its theories to bootstrap itself and transcend those theories. So we use the theory of evolution by natural selection. We find that the theory says with probability 1, you don't see the truth. We say, okay, so in that case, then I need to make a leap and to go to a deeper level. And so I need to come up with a new theory in which space and time are not fundamental, in which there are organisms in competition are not fundamental. And then show how evolution and space-time come from that. So now to go at it at a second level, how can I start with a theory in which there is no time and get time to come out of it? How can I do that? Right? Because that's what I have to do. So here's one way. If I have a Markovian dynamics of conscious agents, so a Markovian dynamics, for those who are not familiar, they're Markov chains. In the finite case, it's literally n by, they're like matrices. Every row of the matrix sums to 1. That's a Markovian kernel. So if you have a matrix operator, a linear operator, and every row of the matrix sums to 1, then it's a Markovian kernel. And these Markovian kernels are sort of governing the state transitions of these dynamical processes of conscious agents. Now here's the deal. you can easily design dynamics of Markovian dynamics of conscious agents that have no entropic time. So, but by that I mean the dynamics may have entropy, but the entropy doesn't increase. It's a constant entropy. So there is no arrow of time. There's no entropic arrow of time in the dynamics of conscious agents. So that's easy to do. But it's a theorem, and if you're interested, I can actually, it's a 3-step proof. I can actually recite the proof right here. It's a theorem, and it's trivial, that if you take any projection of that Markovian dynamics by conditional probability, so any projection of it, you will get an image of the dynamics in which entropy is increasing. So in other words, you start with the dynamics of consciousness that has no entropic time. Any limited view of it, any perspective of it, will have the artifact of time, of entropic time. So what I'm saying is that we can show that time arises not as a fundamental insight into the nature of reality, but as an artifact that is inevitable when we take a projection. When we lose information about reality, then we get time not as an insight, but as an artifact of our loss of information. And by the way, that thing gets to the evolutionary issue. If the fundamental nature of reality has no arrow of time, and time, which is the fundamental resource, right? That's the fundamental limited resource in our game of life, right? If I had endless time, there would be no problem. So if time is an artifact, then the whole world of limited resources, and therefore competition for limited resources, could also be an artifact of projection of a deeper world of consciousness in which there are no limits in resources and there's no competition. There could be cooperation. But that deeper dynamics, when you take any perspective on it, it's a necessary property of a projection that you find, for example, an entropic arrow of time and therefore limited resources.
Thanks. I like this idea. Raman?
I think this is easy to get mathematically, but how do you think an average person can grasp something outside of time intuitively?
Well, that's a really good question. And that gets at another important and deep point. And that is the meaning of words and how we learn the meaning of words. Like as you're pointing out, what does it mean how do we understand a timeless realm? What could that possibly mean? And when we have the same problem as if I want to tell you what it's like to have the taste of a beer. If you've never tasted beer, all I can do is try to say, well, it's bitter, or whatever it might be. But if you've never tasted beer, I'm going to have a heck of a time. I can say the word beer all I want to. You're not going to get it. You need to taste beer. Or if you're blind and I've tried to tell you about the color red, good luck. I mean, I can tell you all. It has these. Good luck if you're blind, unless you've experienced red. So it's really interesting. We assume that other people's experiences are relevantly similar to our own. And the reason I can talk to you about beer is because you and I have both tasted beer. And so we both have that experience. And so I can use the word beer as a pointer. Now, in the case of timelessness, we're going to be in the same position. If there is no place that I could point, if there's no experience you've ever had that's timeless, then I can talk through my head all I want about the timeless. And you'll just say, I have no idea. It's like a blind person with color red. So the best way I can point to it is that people who meditate find when you get to a place where you absolutely have no thoughts whatsoever, you literally, and if you literally are in a position where for at least for a few moments, some people live there permanently, but for a few moments, you experience absolutely no thoughts. Then you get a taste of a feeling of what timelessness is like, a timeless feeling. And if you've never had that experience, then all I can say is that I can't describe it, because just like I can't tell a blind person what red is like. So there's nothing special, by the way, about these features than everyday things like the color red or the taste of beer. There's nothing special about consciousness or timelessness that's particularly, if you've experienced it, then you know what I'm talking about. If you've not experienced it, then of course you don't know what I'm talking about. No big deal.
Another way I'm starting to get how timelessness, or not timelessness, something being outside of time, to be more accurate, could be true, is by understanding the problem of induction in philosophy. So there seems to be no non-arbitrary way to say that a moment is different than another moment. If you get outside of logic, which is based on a set of relatively arbitrary axioms, as well as the problem of the criterion. So if you allow your thinking to expand beyond logic and some of our current postulates, then you might be able to get this, but it's a little too much to swallow for most people.
Yes, but I would also say that it's a standard interpretation of Einstein's theory of special relativity, for example, to think of it as what they call the space-time loaf. And there's just this thing that's sitting there. It's this big static geometric entity. And many physicists will say that our feeling that we're moving through time is just an illusion. That we really are, in some sense, in this timeless reality. The space-time loaf is this timeless reality. We're not flowing, we're not passing through time. So many physicists, and I believe Einstein himself, he thought that time is an illusion, that there really is just this space-time loaf. I'm taking a very, very different point of view. I think that the space-time loaf is just a data structure that space and time are just data structures that we use as an interface to other conscious entities that are completely outside space and time. But we're so used to thinking in terms of space and time that it's hard for us to let it go. But you can let it go, and that's what spiritual traditions and people who meditate find, is that you can actually, by meditating and sitting in absolute silence, you can the interface slowly loses its grip on your imagination, and you can begin, maybe after tens of thousands of hours, to go beyond, to your mind to open up and go beyond. I'm hoping that the science will eventually give us easier way. Meditating for 30,000 hours is a hard way to get there. If science can give us theories that take us there more quickly, I'm all for it.
Well, what I'm trying to say is that I think I'm starting to make sense of the so-called illusion of time by letting go of the inference that one moment is different from another, because that inference is just based on a set of axioms that we happen to find intuitively appealing, but reality does not have to conform to our intellectual axioms.
I agree, and the question would then be, I like what you're saying, and as someone who wants to be scientifically precise, I would like to take your ideas and try to make that a mathematically precise statement, right? So what would be the new structure? What would be the new axioms? And I would, the only way I've been able to come at that so far is as I briefly sketch, is to think about time in terms of the entropic time sense, and to say, I can surely show you a dynamical process that doesn't have entropic time, but project it to something that doesn't have entropic time. But if you can find another approach, I would be, of course, most interested if you could come up with a different kind of axioms where there's, in some sense, you could axiomatize what many spiritual teachers would say, that there's only the now, right? So there's only the now, but it takes different forms. And so if there was some way to take that, so there's no flow of time, it's always now, but somehow the content, the form of now is changing. An axiomatization for that kind of thing, I think, would be worthwhile to try to do. Absolutely.
I think that would be really interesting. Rosetta asks,
Absolutely.
using the UI analogy, if physical objects are icons or representations to some underlying reality, if we were to speculate, what underlying reality do celestial objects represent, like stars and quasars and black holes? Asked by Rosetta.
So I'll make sure I understand. So the question is, can you maybe just repeat the question one more time? I want to make sure I got the thrust of it.
Yeah, sure. Using the UI analogy, if physical objects
Mhm.
are icons or representations to some underlying reality, if we were to speculate, what underlying reality do celestial objects represent, like stars and quasars and black holes?
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, on the theory of conscious agents, right? So, which is the theory that my colleagues and I are working on. The answer is always going to be that it's always an interface to other conscious agents. So those every object in space and time is going to be an icon to a theory to a realm of conscious agents. So that will be the answer we always give. The question will the issue will be in some cases the icon is giving us a more clear portal. The portal is clearer into the nature of those conscious agents. And in other cases, the portal is not clear at all, right? So I see Mars. I'm not seeing much in the way of consciousness, and it's not clear what the consciousness is that I'm interacting with. When I see a person, I'm getting a much clearer portal. So in distant galaxies and so forth, the answer will be the same. Now, ultimately, of course, what I want to do with the theory of conscious agents is to, once we have this mapping from conscious agents into space-time, then we can start perhaps characterizing the nature of the conscious agents behind various icons in more detail. And perhaps we'll also be able then, with each object, maybe we'll figure out how to open that portal and make it more clear. That would be really, that's an interesting thing about this, is once you understand the user interface, once you understand the software that's building the user interface, you can hack the software. You can hack into it and play with it. So we may be able to open new portals into the conscious agents behind distant galaxies and so forth, and see. So the answer is, maybe not terribly happy at this point. It's conscious agents, but which agents I don't know. But the work is clear of what we have to do to try to answer that, and we'll see. It's a great question.
Roy Dobson asks, what do you suppose would happen if you never stopped meditating? If you never left the stillness? Would you not fully realize your enlightenment, as did Ramana Maharshi?
Well, I should at first admit that I'm no spiritual teacher or master or anything like that. So I'm just a humble scientist, and when I start talking on spiritual things, I'm talking as quite a non-expert. So given that proviso, I mean, science and spirituality do need to interact, and so some scientists need to stick their necks out into areas where they're not expert, and so my guess is that it's quite possible that permanent meditation would be much like if you're in a virtual reality and you just take the headset off, right? At some point, you can just take the headset off and you're no longer in that VR, right? So you can imagine being immersed in a game of like Grand Theft Auto, but a virtual reality version of it. And you can imagine getting completely lost in the game. It's such an immersive game that you actually feel your body in the car. You get all these visceral, emotional reactions about you actually feel your life threatened if a car's coming head on at you. You really get immersed on it. So you can get but at some point you could then become quote unquote spiritual. A Grand Theft Auto spiritual master, where you realize, oh, this is just a headset. So now all of a sudden you can just look around, you can see the cars, even if the car is coming at you, you're not worried anymore, because this is not the final reality. This is just a headset. At any point, I can take off the headset, and at some point you do. So for a while, you're like this spiritual guru in that virtual world, because you realize that you're not stuck in that world. So, and then when you literally take the headset off, then you step out of it. And so maybe the answer to your question is that that kind of meditation without stop is effectively the same thing as taking off the headset. It's effectively the same thing as dying, which is stepping out of this headset.
But it's not going to give you access to superpowers, right?
Well, now that's a really interesting question, because the way that people typically think about that kind of thing is they take space and time as fundamental. There is this machine, but they hope that there's also a ghost in the machine, and that it might be so some of my good friends who are doing psi experiments, for example, they're trying to show that consciousness can maybe move certain physics experiments a few digits here or there, and so they're looking for sort of paranormal kinds of effects. But if consciousness is fundamental, what we call the laws of physics just is the way we describe the power of consciousness. That's how consciousness acts. We call them the laws of physics, but that's really our interface description of consciousness. So from within our interface, the claim that there's consciousness that transcends space and time doesn't mean that we can expect easily to have some kind of superpowers within our space-time. It may be that's the way consciousness reveals a superpower, is through what we call the laws of physics and chemistry and biology and so forth. That is our headset view of the immense power of consciousness. Now, it may be, though, that once we understand the headset, we may be able to, in some sense, find a deeper level of rules than just space and time and what we call the laws of physics. And in that sense, we may find that we tap into a much deeper aspect of the power of consciousness than we can tap into right now with our headset. And so in that sense, then yes, we would find that there are superpowers. But I would, one objection that people can have against the theory of conscious agents is to say, surely the theory of conscious agents predicts paranormal effects, and we don't see those paranormal effects. At least we don't have compelling evidence for paranormal effects. And we have no theory. There's absolutely no theory that predicts precisely what those paranormal effects would be. So the psi experiments, and again, I have many good friends and colleagues who do them. I think many of them are really good experimentalists and so forth, but I will tell them repeatedly, if you don't have a precise scientific theory that predicts exactly what level of effect you're going to get, then no scientist is going to take you seriously, nor should they. If there's no theory, then the data are just sitting out there with nowhere to go. So a theory of conscious agents that I'm working on predicts that the laws of physics are just the way we see how consciousness works. I don't need to predict paranormal effects. I mean, I just don't need it. The laws of physics are the description of consciousness. I don't need. So the mistake we make is to think of, okay, there really is space and time. That's a fundamental reality, but there's also consciousness. It's a dualist view. Consciousness is also there, and I need to show that consciousness has some muscles. They might not be very big, but it has some muscles that it can do some stuff in this machine. So I need to show that there are some kind of paranormal or other effects. And I'm saying that whole approach misses what the physicists are telling us. Space-time is doomed. It's not fundamental. If consciousness is the whole show, then the laws of physics just are how consciousness works, and we don't need the paranormal. But I suspect that we will find deeper laws, and in that, we'll do that in the normal scientific manner. We will do deeper experiments. We'll get a deeper theory of consciousness. It will predict new testable experiments that we can do, and we'll find new stuff. Like when Maxwell predicted based on his equations, that there are going to be these electromagnetic waves propagating through space and time. And Heinrich Hertz said, let's go test it. So he builds this little contraption and goes around, and holy smoke, who had ever seen these electromagnetic waves before? But he found them. Why did he find them? Because we had a theory that said to go find them. So there may be effects like that of consciousness all over the place that we haven't found just because we haven't gone deep enough in our theory. But I'm not trying to propose paranormal in the normal sense of paranormal. We just say the laws of science aren't good enough. Here's this that's not my attitude at all. If there are going to be some new properties of consciousness, I want scientifically clean, mathematically precise theories of those, and then go look for them.
Well, on the other hand, I think there are credible reports of people gaining, psi abilities from meditation or introspective experiences. I think the guy who discovered the structure of DNA, or at least one of the people who did it in an acid trip. And in Indian traditions, there are these people. I hope I'm not butchering the pronunciation, but I think they're called siddhis, who gain some sort of abilities through meditation. So we might be able to mess with the interface through either introspection or understanding what underlies the interface. Both could be valid means of altering the interface.
I certainly agree. I think that I wouldn't deny that that there are people who may have, through meditation and other spiritual practices, attained new abilities that are unusual for people, and I would say that we should test that and see. I will say that I have done that. So there was, I won't mention any particular names, but there was a yogi who one of my graduate students was, she was one of his students, and he had hundreds of tapes and lots of followers and so forth, and claimed to have all sorts of extraordinary powers to manipulate objects, to read minds and so forth. And he came to me through his graduate student and asked for me in my lab to test his powers, because he had a book, Yogi in the Lab or something like that, and all these experiments that he'd done where he thought he'd shown that he had these extraordinary powers. And so my student brought me his book and the experiments that he'd done to show that he had these powers. And I I'm a psychophysicist. That's my background, is I know how to do experiments, and I realized that there were holes you could drive a truck through in the methodology. So I said to my graduate, so I decided to do it because I thought it would be good for my graduate student. I said, look, see how these experiments are done. Obviously, these are not clean experiments. There's holes all over the place. Why don't we pick 3 or 4 of them? We'll clean up the experiments, make them airtight by scientific standards, and then I'm happy to have them come in my lab. And because there's this disbeliever effect, right? If you have a disbeliever doing it, sometimes they say you won't get the effects. I will leave. So she was a believer, my student was a believer. I said, I'll let you collect all the data. I'll be absent, and I'll let you analyze the data. And so we came up with 3 or 4 experiments, and she ran her own master on it. And when we looked at the data, there was no need for statistics. There was not a single trial in any experiment in which she showed any unusual abilities. Not one trial. So and I'm not saying that that's going to happen every time. I'm just saying that when I tested someone who is a fairly famous master with dozens of years, many decades of spiritual practice and thousands of followers and hundreds of tapes. When I tested him, he showed it was so clear there was no need for any statistics. There was not a single trial in which he showed an unusual effect. Not one trial. Now, Rupert Sheldrake is a friend of mine, and he and I have taught some seminars together at Esalen. And he's a wonderful man. He's a brilliant brilliant experimentalist, and I think that he's also a very honest and good experimenter. He has experiments where he claims lots of extraordinary effects. Now, I have not tried to replicate Rupert's stuff. You can only do so much in a lifetime, and I'm going after the mathematical models of consciousness. But so for all I know, Rupert does have good evidence in his experiments for that. So that may be the case. What we need, what these people need, is a theory, because without a theory, no scientist will take any notice of this stuff. It'll just be dismissed. So I don't dismiss the possibility that people can develop these super abilities, and I can guarantee you that science will ignore them completely until there's a scientific theory of them that predicts those precise abilities and their magnitudes and extents. So that's what we need to do. So for that, science and spirituality really need to collaborate, right? So I don't doubt, I'll put it this way, I don't doubt that spiritual practice can lead to new extraordinary abilities. Even though I tested one person who claimed and showed that, at least in those 4 experiments, he had no such abilities, I don't doubt that that's quite possible. I would love to get a scientific theory that is informed by deep insights from spiritual traditions that can state precisely what these new powers might be and how we could precisely test them. Then and only then will science and should science take this idea seriously. Until then, there's no beef for science to deal with.
I think it's very strange that different experimentalists seem to get inconsistent results, but I've looked at Rupert Sheldrake's work and it's very tightly controlled. And it was even replicated by a skeptic called Richard Wiseman. He basically got the same data. So that seems very credible to me.
That's right. So I agree.
Sorry. Yeah. So I'll move on to the next question. How would you regard NDEs under your model?
Well, actually, there's a film coming out pretty soon at New York University Langone Hospital. With some, I'm trying to remember the brilliant physician there. It may come to me. But he's been studying. He's been studying for many years the many near-death experiences of patients in his hospital, and so he's got a film coming out on that. And I say a little bit about near-death experiences from my point of view in that film. And the standard view of near-death experiences is a physicalist view, right? So space and time are fundamental. Consciousness is produced by brain activity, although we don't yet know how it does it, but it is. It's produced by brain activity somehow. And so when the brain starts failing in death, it's no surprise from that point of view that you're going to have changes in your conscious experiences. Now in NDEs, right, you often have a tunnel of bright light. You're going through the tunnel. You might be greeting family and friends and so forth. Maybe do a life review, things like that, and maybe even have to take the point of view of people that you hurt in life and understand what it was like from their point. So there are a lot of common stories that come out of these near-death experiences. If you're a physicalist, the answer is just real clear what you have to say. Those are illusions. They're probably hallucinations, and they're just due to the brain improperly functioning. From my point of view, theory of conscious agents, consciousness really does exist, and it exists even if you step outside of space and time. Even if your body dies, consciousness continues. Now, my sense of my identity as Don, Don Hoffman, that story may be part of the headset, right? So when you're in virtual reality and you take off your headset, your avatar is gone. You lose your avatar, right? But you didn't lose yourself. You just lost your avatar. So this body that we call Don Hoffman did such and such, went to such and such school, and lives in such and such place. That's just my avatar. So yeah, that will be shed when I take off the headset. But so these near-death experiences, from my point of view, could be genuine insights of consciousness when it's, taking his headset off and then putting it right back on, right? These people were taking the headset off, but then it comes right back on, but they got a glimpse of what it was like to be taking that headset off. That certainly is possible and perhaps probable within my conscious agent framework. So that's something I'm really interested in exploring, and that's why I agreed to participate in that film on NDEs.
I also think it's pretty interesting that psychedelics and NDEs, they have the same physiological mechanism, because psychedelics shut down a lot of your brain activity, and obviously so does having an NDE, and they seem to lead to some pretty similar results.
Right. I absolutely agree with the spirit of what you're saying. Of course, as a scientist, then I would want to know the precise neurochemical action of the psychedelics and the precise neurochemical structure of what's happening in death in the neurons, and to make the kind of statement that you're making, right? I would want to say that, yeah, it's exactly, this disturbance of the dopaminergic pathway at the substantia nigra or something like that. That's really, if you can make it at that level, then as a scientist, I would find it interesting. But we'll see. It is true that like meditation, for example, tends to tamp down what's called the default mode network, and your sense of self or attachment to a self declines remarkably. So that there is this correlation between attachment to self and activation of the default mode network. And so we may find lots, I expect that we will find lots of correlations like that. Now, my attitude about them is very, very different from my colleagues. What my colleagues, my brilliant colleagues, I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. I'm a professor of that field. I've done some work in fMRI and EEG, and my colleagues have done a lot of it. And what they would say is that, look, it's the neural activity that's causing the, it is the default mode network activation that is causing your sense of self. There's a causal link there. And my attitude is, no, when we look at neuroscience, we look in the human brain and we're analyzing the default mode network and the various attentional networks and so forth, what we're really doing is we're reverse engineering our headset, our interface. We're right. Somehow my body and my brain is an icon that's telling me somehow how this portal from consciousness into this headset is being made, right? How is this interface being made? So we do need to understand neuroscience. We need to reverse engineer neuroscience, because as we see, what we see there are 86 billion interacting entities, very suggestive of a network of interacting conscious agents, right? So we're gonna have to, so I'm claiming that there are conscious agents outside of space-time. What we're seeing in the brain is a network of interacting entities. So I want to reverse engineer the neural networks and push them back into these conscious agent networks outside of space and time. I want to get that mapping. So we have to do lots of neuroscience, and then we'll understand how my avatar of Hoffman, with his attachment to self and his fear of death and his like of this kind of beer and his dislike of that kind of thing, how that whole interface is put together. So we have to understand the neuroscience, but it's not because neurons are fundamental and these unconscious neurons create consciousness. No, the neural networks are the best data that our interface will ever give us about how our interface is actually created. So the interface is giving us information about its own creation, about its own. So we have to study the neural networks themselves in great detail and reverse engineer the networks back to the conscious agent networks. Ultimately, we're going to have to take a big leap and understand conscious agent networks on their own, propose how our interface is created, and then show how that would lead to exactly the kind of neural systems that we see in our brain. So that's what we're ultimately going to have to do. But so you can see how my point of view is very, very different from the standard physicalist point of view, that the brains and the chemicals cause our psychedelic experiences and they cause our NDEs and so forth. I have a completely different point of view.
Well, my point of view is that the brain is an icon for a localization of consciousness, and that's why you have these very remarkable correlations between large reductions in brain activity and mind-boggling transcendental experiences, like in the case of NDEs, in the case of psychedelic experiences, which have been shown to only shut down your brain activity, hypoxia, G-lock, choking, syncope. Bernardo makes this argument pretty rigorously, and I find it pretty compelling. But I'll stop speaking about this now. El, do you have
I'll
a
just
question?
say I agree with you. Actually, I would actually say. I mean, I'm not saying it's true, but I say that that's a really compelling hypothesis. And as a scientist, I think it would be one of my top ones that I would want to test. Absolutely, it's a great hypothesis.
Donald, I wanted to ask you for a clarification on the time issue. When you were speaking about the block universe idea, you mentioned that there is only a now, but the now changes. I wanted to ask you, beyond any notion of temporal extension or of objective time, of measuring of time, would it be adequate to say that at the ground reality is there is no temporal extension, there is no like a before or an after, but would it be okay to say that it changes, that one of its inherent properties is that it evolves, that it grows, that is not the same from quote unquote moment to moment?
Yes. So I can say something actually a little bit technical on that as well. So I agree with you in principle, and here's mathematically how it cashes out in our theory of conscious agents. I mean, I gave you one example with the entropic time and so forth, where there could be no entropic time in consciousness, but an entropic time in any view. But there's another aspect of the mathematics of conscious agents that also, I think, gets to the point of view that you're pointing to about timelessness, and that is this notion that many spiritual traditions have of just an eternal now, but there is just the now, and it is timeless. And in the mathematics of conscious agents, when we define them, and if people are interested, I mean, for those who want the technical details, I can just say we have if you just Google, let's see, it's the title of the paper is called Objects of Consciousness. So if you Google my name, Donald Hoffman, Objects of Consciousness, the paper will come right up on Google, and you can read. It's free. There's no paywall, and you can read the mathematical model of consciousness. So anybody who's interested in getting past just the words and seeing the math, it's easily available. Objects of Consciousness. When you see the math, you'll see that what we write down are probability spaces for the possible conscious experiences of the conscious agent. So there's a probability space. What is a probability space? Well, if my experiment is like to flip a coin twice, my probability space is I could get heads heads, I could get heads tails, tails heads, or tails tails, right? So there's 4 elements in the probability space. Well, so if I'm going to do an experiment, I have to write down my probability. So as a scientist, I have to write down my probability space, right? Here's my probability space. There's 4 outcomes: heads heads, heads tails, so. But before I do the experiment, I don't have any data, right? I just have this structure. It's my probability space. It's just sitting there, but nothing's happening. So I have to do that with conscious agents as well. I write down for conscious agents, say there's this probability of space of possible experiences. Maybe experiences the taste of chocolate, or the smell of garlic, or a headache. So here's all the experiences this agent could have. Well, so I write that down. Now, as a scientist, I'm saying, when I write down mathematics, I'm making a proposal about reality. That's what I'm doing. I'm saying this mathematics corresponds to something about reality. So now it's clear when I actually say, now there's this point of the probability space is active, right? This the chocolate experience. That's an occurrence of a chocolate experience. That's what that means. But what does that probability space mean when there's no experience? Well, maybe it means timeless awareness without content. So we may already have in the mathematical theory of conscious agents our mathematical counterpart of what spiritual traditions are talking about, which is this timeless awareness without content. It's the potential for specific contents, but it doesn't have to, that potential is there even when it's not actualized. And that's what we see literally in our mathematics. So already in our theory of conscious agents, I could argue that our probability spaces are already our mathematical theory telling us there is something that is timeless awareness, literally timeless awareness, and it's right there in the math.
Great, thank you. Before we, 1 second, EL60K. Don, how are you on time?
Go for another 10 minutes or so.
Sure.
10, 15? Sure.
Okay, great. Was there some follow-up comment you had to wanted to ask Don?
So in the line of it being a probability space when represented in the math, would it be fair to say that this timeless consciousness always has the propensity to turn into a specific form of experience? And what will be like the igniting thing, or what will be the difference that will make it actualize into an experience or remain in timelessness?
Great question. You've reached the limits of my understanding with that question. So the mathematics does say that there is a timeless structure, and that structure lays out the potential experiences of that conscious agent. In the simplest case, some of my agents, we call them 1-bit agents because they have only one experience. They either have the experience or not. Like this agent only experiences red. But you can have agents with 1,000 experiences or an infinite number of potential experiences. But your deep question is one that I've thought about, and I don't have anything intelligent to say yet, which is, what breathes fire into the equations, right? As Stephen Hawking said about the equations of physics, what breathes fire into the equations. In some sense, when I write down a probability measure, in fact, anytime in any scientific theory that you write down a probability measure, that probability measure is saying, this is the spot where this theory gives up. Explanation stops. So whenever you see a probability measure, that's where your theory throws up its hands and say, I give up. There's all I can do. I can't tell you why a particular outcome is going to happen. All I can do is give you the probabilities of various outcomes, and I have no mechanism behind that. So the very fact that I'm speaking of a probability space and that I'm using probability measures means that I have no answer to your question. And it may be every scientific theory. I'll put it this way: there is no scientific theory of everything. Period. There cannot be a scientific theory of everything, and I think spiritual traditions would agree with that. They would say that anything that you can say is just a pointer; it's not the real thing, and that's true of scientific theories. So right now I may be able to come up with a deeper theory that gets behind my current formalism and tries to answer your question, but right now I don't have it. But even if I did, then you would be able to come back to me and say, but what about this question? And you will find a new question where I have to throw up my hands and say, you got me. That is a miracle of the theory. And you will, and by the way, I will just admit right up front that you will always be able to do that to any scientist for every theory they come up with. You'll always be able to come up with a question where they have to throw up their hands and say, that is an assumption of the theory. It's a miracle. I would need a deeper theory to answer your question, and I don't have it. So great question. And by the way, that's exactly the kind of question we want. We want to have those questions where we point to where we can't answer, what are the miracles, and can we then see our way to a deeper theory or not?
Thank you, Don. I have a question from Tori. I see who's in the audience right now. Tori asks, why do strange coincidences that Jung called synchronicities happen in the lives of people? And Tori adds that maybe the interface theory of perception or your conscious agents theory has an explanation for that.
That's a really good question. And Jung actually said that it was not causal, right? That this was beyond the notion of cause and effect. There was the synchronicity, in some sense, by definition, is not just cause and effect. It's some deeper coherence to reality. And that's certainly, without claiming, by the way, that I have a theory of it and I can unpack his ideas. I'm not claiming that at all, but I would say that
just your general thoughts on it will be nice too. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, the theory of conscious agents certainly allows for those kind of synchronicities because it's proposing that there is this realm that transcends space-time. So if there is a fundamental unity of the agent dynamics that gets projected into space-time. So as I mentioned before, if you do any kind of projection, you're going to get time as an artifact of that projection. It just happens that way. So things that look like they're being really cleverly organized in time could just be pointing to a synchronicity in the original space of consciousness where it's timeless. And it's just a feature of the timeless nature of the interaction of conscious agents that in our temporal perspective of it, it looks like there are these wonderful synchronicities. This happened just before that happened, and that happened just right after that happened, or at the same time, and so forth. So, but the nice thing about the theory of conscious agents is we can start to, with mathematical precision, study what we might call synchronicities. So we can propose, let me have this particular dynamics of agents, and it has no increasing entropy. So there's no time, entropic time. Let me try this specific mathematical projection. Now, when I start to look at the sequence of events and the increasing entropy in my projection, can I start to see things that would look like synchronicities? And if so, what do they point to back in the original dynamics? So in other words, I agree with Jung's idea of synchronicity. We now need to take that idea and make it mathematically precise. We need to have a dynamics of conscious agents, which we now have, that can be done without entropic time. We can do that. So the next step is take any projection you want, see in that projection what look like synchronicities. And now that you have the whole structure, pull those synchronicities back to the original dynamics that's beyond space-time and ask, what is it about the dynamics of the whole that looks like synchronicity in the projection? So in other words, I'm saying I like Jung's idea. We now have the chance to turn it into a science, not just a hand wave. Let's do it.
Fair enough. I think we're nearing the end of your 10 minutes. I would like to ask if Raman has one last question.
Yeah, sure. I'll pick out a question from the audience.
Great, thanks.
Scott Harrison asks, what is your take on Thomas Campbell's theory of everything? He has had podcasts with Rupert Spira, whom you have read and studied.
Well, actually, Tom Campbell has asked if we might do a podcast together. So we'll probably do one. I said, sure, I'd love to do one, and we haven't arranged the time yet, but I'd love to talk with him and go into his ideas. My attitude is, first, as I said, there is no theory of everything. So, and I don't think Tom is any exception. So I don't have a theory of everything. No scientist can have a theory of it. So there is no theory of everything. So all we can hope to have is our next theory. I think he and I are on the same page in that we're trying to take consciousness as fundamental. We're trying to see physics somehow emerge. So I'm on the same page on that. So the issue is, what we can do is we can never have a theory of everything, and we should be really upfront that there is no theory of everything, including when we have our theory of consciousness, not a theory of everything. Now, where I think in my discussion with Tom, we'll probably find that we differ is that his theory is not taking into account the new discoveries that physicists are making of the amplituhedron, the cosmological polytope, and the associahedron, and so forth. There are these new structures beyond space-time. And I should just mention, instead of just throwing out the names, I'll just mention a couple of wonderful things that they do. If you try to compute the scattering effects of particles like in the Large Hadron Collider, you look at like one of the simple things that happens all the time, apparently. 2 gluons come smashing into each other, 4 gluons go spraying out. Apparently that's just a vanilla scattering event for these people. If you try to do it in space-time using Feynman diagrams and quantum field theory, and you're looking at all the virtual particles and adding up all the loops and so forth, you get billions of terms and hundreds of pages of algebra for one scattering event to compute it. But if you use the amplituhedron, you let go of space-time. It's one term. The billions of terms get collapsed to a single term you can compute by hand. And also you discover that scattering process has deep symmetries, an infinite Yangian symmetry that you can't see in space-time. You can see one aspect of it in space-time, you can see another aspect of it in twistor space, but you can't see the whole symmetry in either of those spaces. So the physicists are discovering these magically powerful structures beyond space-time that when you let go of space-time, you let go of quantum theory, you let go of Einstein's special relativity, you just let go of them. They're not fundamental. The math goes from billions of terms to 1 or 2 terms, a handful of terms that you can easily compute. You see new symmetries. There's a world beyond space-time, and physics has just opened the doors to it. A theory of consciousness that ignores these new structures has no chance. And so that's why I think it'll be fun to talk with Tom, because I think that we need to talk about his theory of consciousness, my theory of consciousness, and how we're going to have our theories of consciousness dovetail with the new discoveries of the amplituhedron and cosmological polytopes beyond space-time. I want to show that those structures that the physicists have found are actually projections of a deeper dynamics of consciousness. And that the paper I'm writing right now is proposing exactly that map. So that's what I was writing just before this conversation, and that's what I'll be doing as soon as we get off the conversation, is going back, after lunch or something like that. Then I'll go back and start working on this paper, which is proposing a specific projection of conscious agents onto something called decorated permutations, which then give rise to positive Grassmannian, and from that to the amplituhedron. So I'm very happy to talk with Tom, and I've already, he's kindly invited me to talk with him, and I've agreed. So I'm hoping that'll happen the next few weeks or months, and we'll have a good conversation about that. But I let him know in my reply that I will, as I've just said, will want to talk about these new structures beyond space-time. We can't just be stuck with our own theories. We need to actually connect with what the new physics is. So that'll be fun.
Yeah, I do think that Tom does take at least time to be fundamental, so that'll be interesting. Jack?
Thanks. I think I'm going to end it right here. Don, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much for your generosity.
Yeah, yes. He's very generous. For everybody listening, thank you for being here. And for everybody who sent in questions, thank you for your great questions. And I wish you all very good. Well, Don, I wish you a very good day. And for the rest of us, good evening.
Okay.
Enjoy your work.
Thank you very much. Good to talk. Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye.